Hello and welcome. Today we will be discussing the rules of Regicide, the combat rules that is, going over the beginning of the book. This is the latest playtest, playtest 3. I'm a D&D guy myself, most experience in D&D. I've read through Pathfinder, read through Tiny Dungeon, but really I have little experience in other game systems. So I would love to hear if this has already been done before. If I'm just making up the rules that someone has already made. But we'll have to see as we dive in here. The order of things is hard to organize. There are so many interlinking sections of the rules that it's hard to go through any one section without referencing something else. It's going to come later. So, the overview. Tabletop role-playing game, like D&D, like Pathfinder, we know these things. D6 system. D6s are the only things you'll need. Pen and paper, of course, as well. And the combat, where to begin? I guess we begin at the beginning. Starting with some specifics for all the rules. If a value is ever divided, always round up. Gotta love that. All multiplying and dividing of values happens after any relevant pluses or minuses are applied. And specific rulings always override general ones. It's most pertinent to the changes that perks make. It's a perk-based system. No class, no race, no ability scores. We'll get into it. It's a pretty minimal system. All characters start with 10 hit points, 4 power, and a speed of 4 meters. That will all be discussed shortly. Combat, we're going to start with initiative, the way combat starts, how the round and turns and dice work, how basically checks work, challenges and contests in this system, attacking, defending, damage, and then we'll finally get to character creation, the perks, the progression of the character, and a little bit about the equipment. So there's going to be a lot of stuff referencing to the later sections, but we'll figure it out. For combat, Regicide can be played anywhere, but it's designed to take place on a 1 inch by 1 inch grid with miniatures where 1 inch equals 1 meter. Most grids are going to be 1 inch by 1 inch, at least where I am, so it's good to work with that system. But I do think that the 5 foot, the classic 5 foot, 1 inch from D&D is a little wide. I know it's made to represent the space that you can command in combat, like your personal bubble, kind of. But when designing rooms and dungeons and things, it looks fine on the grid. The minis look great there. But if you imagine the room being 25 by 50 feet long, it tends to be way bigger than I think it is. Since this is a simpler, kind of lower power, smaller system, fewer combatants, smaller encounters, I think the 1 meter is going to better represent those kind of tight spaces. If you're fighting in this room, there'll be enough space to fit at least 9 people in a combat. It could be a little cramped, but you know. Also, 1 meter from 1 inch metric to imperial, I don't know, but Minecraft does it. And 1 meter in Minecraft makes sense to me. So, combat begins when a combatant takes the initiative. This does not involve rolling to see who has the highest roll and goes first. Whoever acts first is going to start things off. At the start of combat, all combatants have dice equal to their power. Remember that all characters start with 4 power, so you start with 4 dice in your pool. After the first combatant makes any actions they wish, they pass their turn, and initiative follows turn order, going around the table until all combatants have taken a turn, and this is defined as a round. It's pretty straightforward, and the second round begins with the second turn of the first combatant. Rounds continue until the end of combat, which is when all combatants able to act decide to take no actions and pass their turn. That's all pretty straightforward overview stuff. More specifically, initiative determines the order in which combatants take their turns. Combat can be initiated in a number of ways, but they typically alert, threaten, or damage another combatant. The first combatant to act takes the initiative, spending dice from their pool for the first turn. If they take initiative against enemies that are not aware of them, the classic surprise challenge from 5e, the enemies are surprised and cannot react during the first turn of combat. The first combatant takes their turn as normal, and they pass their turn to the next combatant. So currently, there is no way to hold your action. There's no way to act as one on a surprise round, which I know is a common thing. Let's all shoot the bad guy at the same time, for example. But currently, there's no way to do that in these rules. I'm sure we can find a way going forward. But for now, it's only the first person's turn where the enemies can't react, the people who are surprised. Turn orders passed around the table clockwise or counterclockwise determined at random. Since we're not rolling a turn order to see who goes first around the table, we're just going to keep it simple, go around the table based on a random roll. However, this can run into a problem with the GM, since the GM is typically controlling more than one combatant or groups of combatants. So their turns should be evenly mixed with the players, which can also be determined at random. And once all combatants have taken their turn, the round is over, and the next round begins with the first combatant's turn. As we have said, combatants can join and leave initiative in certain circumstances as well. So, turns, the dice. These aforementioned dice, 4 of them you have on your turn with 4 power. There's 6-sided dice. In the rules, there are 3 different types. There are action dice, AD, hero dice, HD, and outer dice, OD. Unless specified, most dice referred to in the text are action dice. Hero dice are special extra dice for one-time use, awarded at the GM's discretion. This is the inspiration system for Regicide. And the outer dice are dice outside of any dice pool used to determine things at random. So, for example, when you're determining whether to go clockwise or counterclockwise, that can be done with outer dice. These are just the things you use when you're making random rolls. So the action dice are the most important ones, really. That's what we're going to be focusing on for most of this combat section. Mostly just referred to as dice, since they're the most common, are used to perform most tasks while in combat. They're an abstraction of time as well as effort. So a roll that uses more AD might reflect the use of more effort without taking more time, or vice versa. Some useful definitions follow. The dice pool represents how many dice you have available at any time during a round. So you start your round with 4 dice in your dice pool. If you use one of them, you have 3 dice in your dice pool, etc. Combatant's power determines the number of dice they start each combat with and the number they start each of their turns with. Any extra dice left in the pool at the start of a combatant's turn cease to exist. Power is generally a good descriptor of how dangerous a given combatant is, since more dice mean faster attacks and harder hits. As far as the ceasing to exist goes, that just means if you end your turn with 2 dice in your pool and you have a power of 4, you're not going to start the next turn with 6. You'll just start the next turn with 4. You'll always start with dice equal to your power. To gain dice, you add 1 or more dice to your pool, usually caused by special abilities or magic, maybe. And to lose dice, you remove 1 or more dice from your pool. This is the main mechanic used to fuel activities during combat. You can lose dice by taking actions and reacting, as well as by being hit, especially hard, slowed, or stunned, although that's more rare. Mostly it's a voluntary act. If you're required to lose more dice than are in your pool to activate a certain ability, you can't activate it. So if you have no dice, you can't make your 1 die actions. And if an effect causes you to lose more dice than are in your pool, you take damage equal to the number of dice lost below 0. That's going to come up again when we talk about falling, being pushed into walls, etc. The 2 voluntary ways to lose dice are as follows. Some tasks require you to spend them. When dice are spent, they're lost, and you do not roll them. And some tasks require you to roll them. I wonder what that does. When dice are rolled, they're lost, and you do roll them. The value of the roll will affect the outcome of your activity, usually because it is difficult or contested. And the value of a roll includes all relevant modifiers, while the value of a die includes no modifiers. That's going to be important for critical hits, where you need to roll 6 on the die. Additionally, you can speak, drop prone, and drop objects without expending dice. So, we got a few symbols to talk about here when it comes to actions and reactions. We have the hollow square, we have the filled in square, the X, and the tap symbol for the reactions. Kind of like the symbol used in Pathfinder, although I've only read through it, I have yet to play it. So the number of hollow square symbols determine how many dice an action requires you to spend, while the number of filled in square symbols determines how many dice the action requires you to roll. If there's an X symbol, that number, depending on what it is, can be dictated by the GM or be up to you. Hollow square W from the chat. Yeah, I have to agree. On your turn, you can perform any number of actions as long as you have enough dice. Dice that you do not spend on actions can be used to perform reactions on another combatant's turn. The number of tap symbols determine how many dice a reaction requires you to roll, and you can only react once per player action. The combatant performing the triggering action cannot make a reaction. That is the simplest and easiest way to handle this ruling, but I can see some scenarios where it would seem a little unintuitive. We'll have to see in some playtesting. The reactions follow turn order. So, what kind of actions do we have at our disposal? We have challenges, are the main one, in contests is a form of reaction to the challenge. This is your checks and saves, basically, from 5e. Challenges and contests make up the majority of roles an adventurer will be required to perform. Both are voluntary, use action dice, and function similarly, the main difference being that challenges are actions performed on your turn, while contests are reactions performed on another combatant's turn. Whether or not a challenge succeeds depends on the difficulty. This is your DC from 5e. Rolling above the difficulty indicates a success, wow, and rolling below indicates a failure. While when the difficulty is met exactly, the challenge is a partial success. That is DM discretion territory. The difficulty is set by the game master before the roll. And after the difficulty is set, the combatant decides how many dice they wish to roll to beat it. I'll cover this in a little bit. We'll just get through here. During combat, challenges and contests can be made with the challenge filled in square in X, and the contest reaction in X actions, respectively. Outside of combat, they function in a similar way. Most challenges are quick, and X equals 0 or 1. For example, forcing open a locked door, picking someone's pocket, and scanning for hidden enemies. The rules of a challenge are less clear-cut than those governing attacks, since the nature of different challenges can require different rulings. In general, combatants must be adjacent to the object or combatants involved to participate. Whenever a combatant declares how they would like to participate, the GM determines whether or not it's possible before the steps continue. And before anyone commits to the challenge, the DM decides the difficulty and announces it to all combatants. This is one thing I like to do in D&D. Obviously, this is going to be up to game masters running these adventures, but declaring the DC before they roll, I find, is really valuable. It puts the fate in the dice's hands. You know, you don't have to worry about making those calls if you didn't really come up with a DC in your head. The combatant whose turn it is and who's making the challenge is known as the challenger for the challenge. The challenge can be directed towards objects as well as combatants. An object targeted by the challenge is known as the obstacle for that challenge, while a combatant targeted by the challenge is known as the contester for that challenge, since they'll be making a contest if they wish. Any other combatants not involved in the challenge are known as bystanders for that challenge. Now, this is a little specific, but here's the breakdown. Steps to make a challenge are made in the following order. First, the challenger declares how they would like to participate, how many action dice they wish to spend. During the challenging process, all action dice declared by combatants are committed to the challenge and cannot be taken back before the dice are rolled. In Regicide, all the dice are rolled at the same time for attacks and defense, as well as for challenges and contests. So during this bidding process, no one's going to roll until all the dice have been committed. If there is a contester, they can declare whether or not they wish to contest the challenge and how they would like to participate, as well as how many AD they wish to spend. And a form of binning begins following turn order, starting from the challenger if there is no contester, or from the contester if there is one. Each combatant, challenger, contester, and bystanders included, who wishes to participate, either in favor of the challenger or obstacle contester, declares how they would like to participate, how many AD they wish to spend, using the contest tap X reaction. This process continues until all combatants have committed the available AD action dice that they wished to. All dice are rolled simultaneously. Any results are determined, and the challenge resolves. The result is determined by comparing the sum of all rolls in favor of the challenger to the sum of all rolls in favor of the obstacle/contester plus the declared difficulty if it's an obstacle involved. The challenge resolves in favor of the higher sum, but may resolve in a tie, and the results for the challenge can have varied effects based on the nature of the challenge as determined by the GM, as we know. Quick note, while we're talking about rolling dice, we have advantage and disadvantage X. This gets out of hand very quickly, but I think it's exciting. So I don't want to have a lot of extra dice lying around. I originally had it where you roll that many more dice and ignore that many fewer, or that many of the lowest or that many of the highest for advantage and disadvantage, respectively. But if you're bringing 4 dice to the table, you should only need 4 dice, I believe. So they changed the number. Instead of changing the number of dice you're rolling, they change the number that a given roll is multiplied by. Advantage X causes a roll to be doubled X times, while disadvantage X causes a roll to be halved X times. Note about halving and rounding up. No matter the decimal point, you'll always be rounding up. So even if your roll is halved 1,000 times, the minimum you can get is a 1. Since even though it'll be a 0.0 blah 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 1, you'll still round up to 1. Always round up. If a creature has multiple advantages or disadvantage affecting a single roll, they're all applied simultaneously, canceling each other out. As you could imagine, a creature with advantage 3 and disadvantage 2 makes it as though they had advantage 1, while a creature with advantage 2 and advantage 1 makes it as though they had advantage 3. Quick little equations for all of you math heads out there. We've got the advantage X equals roll times 2 to the X, while disadvantage X equals roll times 2 to the minus X, or roll divided by 2 to the X. So if you have advantage 2, you're multiplying by 4. If you have disadvantage 3, you're dividing by 8, etc. Now I have a list of some of the classic actions and reactions that you'll make. Got the challenge and the contest, which we covered. Some things from Pathfinder, like grab an edge. Some simple things like jump. When you jump, you spend 1 die without rolling it to jump out up to your speed, which remember is 4 meters, or up 1 meter. Step takes 1 die. You carefully move 1 meter. Unlike most types of movement, stepping does not trigger reactions. They can be triggered by moving into or out of a square or within another creature's reach. There's currently no opportunity attack systems. But step is important to define here so that we can use it later on with things like perks for dodging, where if you dodge, you also step, and things like that. While moving is moving up to your speed. You can also split it up. We have crawling, which is moving up to half your speed while prone. That's pretty self-explanatory. Standing up takes 1 die, causes you to stand up from prone. Interacting with object is 1 die. We know all about that. Focus. This is a sneaky one, sneaking in here with the normal actions instead of with the attacks. I've yet to see anyone put it to good use, but I'm sure that if it stays in the rules, it could be a very powerful skill. Gives you +3 bonus to your next attack. Can only benefit from focusing once per attack. I believe that's from Pathfinder as well. I'm not sure. And reloading, also here, even though it's referencing the attacks, is a hollow square X. Most of the time, it's going to be X equals 0 in the hollow square. It's only going to cost you 1 to reload. Reloading involves moving a piece of ammunition from your inventory and loading it into your weapon. What a shock. This includes knocking an arrow, loading a crossbow, etc. Some heavier crossbows may take longer to reload, which is where X might be 1 or more, but most weapons can be reloaded by spending 1 die. Now we get to attacking. This is going to mention a lot about weapons, mostly, since there are light attacks and heavy attacks, which I'll get into in a moment. But we won't cover all the equipment until a bit later on. Now, these are the light and heavy attacks that we know and love from things like Dark Souls and For Honor, for example. But rather than being modes for all weapons, the light and heavy attack is differentiated based on whether the weapon is light or heavy. And there will, of course, be perks that allow you to make light attacks with heavy weapons, heavy attacks with light weapons, and so forth. So weapons come in various categories with different abilities. What? No way. The two main categories are melee and ranged weapons. For melee weapons, they are either light or heavy. Light weapons make light attacks, while heavy weapons make heavy attacks. Some melee weapons may also be thrown. Thrown melee weapons can make ranged attacks and only require one hand to wield. Additionally, melee weapons come with an effective reach. Targets outside of a weapon's reach cannot be hit by that weapon. The reaches are short and long. Short weapons have a 1 meter reach and only require one hand to wield, while long weapons have a 2 meter reach and require two hands to wield, but can be held in one hand. We have a little chart here of the short and light weapons, the short and heavy weapons, etc. I'll get into it a little more specifically on the back with some example weapons. Ranged weapons need to be reloaded and require two hands to wield, can be held in one hand. They usually only make ranged attacks. Think of your bow bash or crossbow bash from Skyrim more as an unarmed attack rather than a melee weapon attack with the ranged weapon. Ranged and thrown weapons have an effective range. This works like damage fall off, kind of, in video games. Attacks with these weapons work normally up to that distance, while attack rolls beyond a weapon's range take -1 penalty for each meter beyond the effective range. If you have a 20 meter range, you're good within there. If the guy's 24 meters away, you have -4 on that attack. Additionally, ranged attacks against a target within 1 meter take a -1 penalty. That's that disadvantage at melee range from 5e. Here, just a -1 penalty. Some weapons also have unique characteristics, especially weapons with magical properties, but we won't get into that yet, or today at all, I don't believe. But some example weapons will include, we have one of each type. A simple dagger would be light and short, maybe have a thrown 4 meter range. And its crit effect, which we'll get into shortly, basically rolling at least 1/6 on your attack dice, says that as the attack resolves, you may step without expending AD. There's your step from the simple rules, which means if you roll a 6 on your attack, you get to move 1 meter for free. Should range damage drop be proportional to total range? Do you mean like the increments? If you have like a 40 meter range, it should drop off in like 4 meter increments, like that kind of thing? I've considered that before. The way Pathfinder handled it was, this was in the original like playtest 1 rules, I believe. It would come with like a 10 meter range. So it would work normally up to the first 10 meters, and then like between 10 and 20 it would be -1. Between 20 and 30 it would be -2, for example, and so forth. So if you had a longer range, you'd have longer fall off values. Might consider going back to it, but I think it needs some play testing. It's hard to come up with a. It's true that if you, since we're rolling d6s, if you have even -6 on a roll, you're practically gonna miss guaranteed. And it is a little unbelievable that someone at 40 meters versus 46 meters would be the difference between a guaranteed hit and a total miss. So maybe we'll go back to that. Thank you for the comment. So that's a simple short and light weapon. A short and heavy weapon, which means 1 meter reach, one hand, but 2 dice on the attack, would be something like a mace, with a crit being, as the attack resolves, you may also shove the target. We'll get into the shove with the unarmed attacks. That would be without expending AD. The longsword would be an example of a light and long weapon, which means if you roll 1 on the attack dice, it has a 2-meter reach and requires 2 hands to wield, with a crit possibly being as the attack resolves, you gain 3 passive defense until the start of your next turn. Great sword, heavy and long, 2 hands, 2 dice, 2 meters, with a crit. As the attack resolves, you gain 1 AD, letting you continue to swing on into combat. An example of a simple ranged weapon might be the longbow, with reload 1, as we discussed earlier, range 40 meters. In this version of the rules. With a crit, as the attack resolves, you may reload without expending AD, for example. Attack options include the 3 simple ones, and then the unarmed attack, which I get to. Light attack, you make a light attack. Heavy attack, you make a heavy attack. Ranged attack, you make a ranged attack, with a little note about the fall off. The unarmed attack, however, has quite a bit of information about it. This has been very difficult to hammer out, but I think it's in a pretty good spot for playtesting now. The unarmored attack has 4 main modes with 1 sub mode. And it's 1 die that you roll. You make an attack roll against an adjacent target, a person within 1 meter. Unarmed attacks do not require a free hand. Think about punching someone while holding your sword, or shoving someone while holding your shield, choking someone while holding your dagger, these type of things. When making the attack, choose one of the following attack modes. Note that a hit on an attack roll equals a successful attack. We'll get into that shortly with resolving attacks, but it basically means for the first mode, bludgeon, the target takes damage as normal. That's not relevant because it works normally, but for the rest of them, rather than dealing damage, it cares whether or not it's a successful attack, whether or not the attack hits, and gives you a special effect. The first special effect would be disarm. Target takes no damage, but is disarmed of any one item they're currently holding. The item falls to the floor in the space of your choice, either any space adjacent to you or the target, or at either of your feet. So if you're standing right next to each other, there are, I believe, 12 total boxes that you could choose to drop the item into. The grapple is the most rules-intensive one, and it's hard to determine whether or not it's realistic, whether or not this is the way to do it. But for now, the target takes no damage but is grappled by you. While grappled, you and the target move together, which means that if you drop prone, so does the target. If you move or step, the target moves in the same direction. If you fall from a ledge, the target falls with you. Additionally, if the target moves in any of the above ways, so do you. The combatant who is grappling decides which adjacent space the grappled combatant is in whenever the combatants move, and your speed is halved while grappled or grappling. 2 notes here: at all times during a grapple between 2 combatants. Between multiple combatants, it gets totally out of hand currently, but we'll have to see. We'll have to do some big grapple contests and see how it goes. At any time during a grapple between 2 combatants, there's one who is grappled and one who's grappling. So one person who is in control of the situation, one person is being controlled, basically. If a grappled combatant successfully grapples the one grappling them, they gain control of the grapple and the roles reversed. So at one time, there's only one grappler and one grappled. The grapple ends if the combatant grappling has no dice in their pool or decides to release the other combatant, which can be done at any time for free. It requires no ID. Which means that currently, if I'm being grappled by you, the only way I can get out of it is to attempt to grapple you. You can attempt to dodge this, because this is all part of an attack, the unarmed attack. You can attempt to dodge. If I succeed and I take control of the grapple, I can then choose to release you and be free from the grapple. Additionally, you always have to keep up at least 1 die. So if I am grappling you, or if you're grappling me and you only have 1 die in your pool, since the grapple ends if you have no dice, I can decide to grapple you, and instead of rolling, you can say I'm actually just going to release the grapple, for example. Now, the sub mode of grapple would be the choke. If you attempt to grapple a combatant who is already grappled or grappling, you may instead choose to choke them, which means, let's just go back to that scenario real quick where you have one die and I'm going to try to grapple you. Rather than trying to dodge and maybe getting choked, since we're in a grapple, you can choose to release the grapple. Then, should I grapple you, you would just be grappled and not choking. But the target who is choked takes no damage but is grappled by you and is choking. Choking combatant loses 1 power at the start of each of their turns before gaining dice for the turn. So with 4 power, that means when it comes back to your turn, you would drop to 3 power and then gain 3 dice for the turn instead of 4. This would continue as long as you're still being choked. If the power is reduced to 0, they become unconscious for 1 OD rounds. That means 1 to 6 rounds outside of any pool. And if the choke ends before their power is reduced to 0, it's immediately returned to normal. However, if the choke is maintained for 5 minutes, the choking combatant dies. 5 minutes is a long time. This probably won't be happening during combat, but to the best of my ability, researching it, that seems to be the average time that you can survive a choke like that. So it could work in a hostage kind of situation at the end of a combat. And finally, for the unarmed attacks, we have the shove, which is pretty self-explanatory. The shove target takes no damage, but is shoved 1 meter in any direction. A combatant shoved upwards or downwards falls prone instead. That's the end of the attacks. So now we have the steps for attacking, which will unfortunately be interrupted by the methods of defending before we return to the steps for resolving the attack by combining the attack and defense. But the steps for the attack, just like the steps for the challenge and the contest, we have a little naming to go over. Combatants whose turn it is and who is making the attack is known as the attacker. The combatant targeted by the attack is known as the defender, and anyone not involved in the attack are known as bystanders for that attack. To make an attack, first the attacker declares which attack action, which valid target, and which weapon they're using. They do not roll their attack until the defender declares their defense, if any. Speaking of which, we have armor and shields, 2 main types of defensive boosting in addition to your defense options for rolling. For the armor, this is going to contribute to your passive defense, which is always on. You don't have to roll. Light armor, like leather, gives you a +1 bonus. Medium armor, like chain, etc., gives you +2. Heavy armor, like plate, etc., gives you +3. Pretty straightforward. Shields are similar to armor, but they only work while they're in use, which includes parrying and blocking with them. Shields give you a bonus based on the type. Small shields give +1, medium +2, and large +3. So these defense options, as we know from Dark Souls, For Honor, etc., the parry, the block, and the dodge. Parry, you are targeted by a melee weapon attack. Can't parry a ranged attack currently. You make a defense roll in an attempt to parry the attack made against you. You add the total to your defense for that attack. You must be wielding a shield or weapon when targeted to parry. Originally, I had small shield and light weapon, but that seems to be like a misconception, I feel like, in video games, that a buckler would be more effective at parrying since it's quicker. It seems to be that any shield or any weapon will do, but we'll have to see. I also think it's kind of one of those minute rules that most people will forget or gloss over, and there's pretty much no reason to include it. So we'll simplify. For the block, you're targeted by any attack. You make a defense roll in an attempt to block the attack made against you. Adding the total to your defense for that attack, you must be wielding a shield or weapon when you are targeted to block. However, weapons can only block melee weapon attacks, which means you can block an arrow with your shield, but you cannot block an arrow with your sword currently. The dodge is the most universal of all the defense options. You're targeted by any attack. You make a defense roll in an attempt to dodge the attack made against you, and you add the total to your defense for that attack. You don't have to be wielding anything or doing anything to dodge. Also, I should note, this is not really a dodge roll like in Dark Souls. It's more like the dodge in For Honor where you kind of step to the side. So even while you're grappled, you can still dodge attacks and things like that. It's the universal defense. So after the attacker has declared his attack and all the specifics about it, the defender declares one of the above reactions, if any. They can choose not to defend, choosing a valid defense against the weapon type, and also declaring what, if anything, they're using to defend with, such as their shield or weapon. The bystanders declare any other reactions to the attack in turn order, starting from the attacker. And then we get into resolving the attack. So everyone has declared what kind of reactions and actions they're making, how they're doing it, what they're doing it with. Then all dice are rolled simultaneously, any results are determined, and the attack resolves. Attack rolls are compared to a defender's total defense to determine how much damage they take. The total defense includes the passive defense from armor and other sources, mostly magical, but mainly from armor, plus any defense rolls made against that attack. Note that total defense does not always reduce damage from effects that specifically deal it, like falling, being pushed into a wall, environmental effects like fire, acid, and poison, stuff like that, as well as some spells and abilities that we'll get into another day. The difference between total attack and total defense determines whether or not the defending creature takes damage. What a shock. So, if the total defense beats the total attack by 0 or more, tie goes to the defender, 0 or more. The attack misses, and any damage or other effects are avoided. For example, if total attack is 4 and total defense is 6, the attack and any damage has been avoided. For flavor, attacks that miss might deflect off a defender's armor or shield, or might be completely dodged. They can leave the defender with small bruises or scrapes, but no real injuries. I'll get into that discussion a little bit more with hit points, the way hit points are meant to represent your life force. Whenever an attack misses and one or more of the dice rolled to defend have a value of 6, the defense is a critical defense. Critical defenses cause special effects based on what was used to defend. Someday I'll get around to making an arms and equipment type guide, which will cover all various sorts of weapons and their crit effects, as well as various sorts of shields and their critical defense effects. But currently, there's nothing yet, except for those 5 example crits from the weapons section. So that's the successful defense. But whenever an attack beats the defense by 1 or more, the attack hits and the defender takes that much damage. So if the total attack is 6 and the total defense is 4, the attack deals 2 damage to the defending creature. Attacks that hit bypass a defender's armor or shield and are not dodged. They leave the defender badly bruised or bleeding and can lead to lasting injuries or death, which we'll talk about shortly. Whenever an attack hits and 1 or more dice rolled on the attack have a value of 6, it is a critical hit, as we mentioned before. They cause special effects based on what was used to attack. We'll cover more eventually with some arms and equipment. But like those 5 examples earlier, that's the critical hit. However, you don't have to roll a 6. Characters may also risk their weapon to inflict a critical hit on an opponent by breaking it over them. When declaring the attack, this is before any defense modes are declared, the attacker can choose to break their weapon. If they do and their attack hits, it's a critical hit. They do not need to roll any dice with a value of 6. Broken weapons, which we'll get into later, are no longer usable without repair. I've had some people be a little concerned about this system, since like, oh, what if I come in with 10 daggers and I break it over him every time and I get the crit every time? It could be done. Maybe it's a viable strategy, but keep in mind that you got to interact every time you run out of daggers. You got to interact, pull out a new one, which is going to cost you 1 die for that interact with object. So really, you're going to be making 1 attack with 2 dice just for the chance of a crit, which may not be the most viable strategy. But in those times of need, when you really need that crit effect and you have weapons to spare, or you're just getting out of there, you have that option. Now, if that was too powerful, then combos are definitely too powerful. This is kind of tacked on to the end here. one of the more recent additions to this playtest version, and it can get out of hand very quickly. Combos work with advantage, so the higher your combo is, the more times you're doubling, quadrupling, or multiplying by 8 your attack, which can be super deadly super quickly. But I think it gives enough critical decision making for the people defending, because you can run into a situation where, say we each have 4 dice. It seems to be in playtesting that the if it's a 1v1, the safest route is to attack, and then save up 2 to block. So the other guy just used 2 of his dice to block. He comes to his turn, he gets 4, he attacks, and he saves up his 2 dice to block. This can go back and forth forever. Each of you might take a few points of damage depending on how much armor you have. And when it comes to the point where someone's like, screw it, I'm going all in, I'm spending all 4 of my dice, they might get 2 extra hits in, but it comes back to their turn and they're defenseless for 4 hits unguarded from the enemy, which will typically end the fight. So if you can hit some 2-hit combos in there, or even risk it for the 3-hit, you can break that stalemate more easily, I think. But we'll have to see. So these combos function by building up points, which don't really need to be kept track of anywhere because they vanish very quickly. But these points, or this combo, can be finished for a devastating effect. For each attack that successfully hits, the attacker gains 1 combo point. They do not have to be gained using the same weapon or against the same defender. If a combo is broken, all built-up points cease to exist. So against the same weapon and same defender type thing, that means if I've got 2 guys here and you're over there, I can hit this guy with my dagger, hit this guy with my sword, and then come over and do a combo finisher on you. There are a few stipulations to that. The combo will break in 3 ways. Firstly, if you miss an attack, a successful defense that causes a combo to break is known as a combo breaker. This will be relevant for perks later on, but it has no effect in the basic rules. But there can be a defender type build where you want to hit combo breakers for extra effect. If you spend AD on anything other than an attack while you have combo points, they cease to exist. So if I'm back here and I want to hit you with my combo kill, I'm going to have to spend my first die to move, adding 4 dice to, or 4 movement, 4 meters, for example, if my speed is 4 meters. Hit this guy, and then my last die, hit you. If I instead hit this guy, and then decide to move up to you, that's going to break that combo right there. It's really like a quick, like, flashy combo. But the most important way that combo can break is with the finisher. When you're declaring an attack, so again, this is before any defense modes are declared or anything, the attacker can choose to declare it as a finishing move as long as they are currently in a combo, as long as they currently have combo points. And when you do, the attack gains advantage X, where X is the number of combo points. So in this scenario, if I successfully hit both of these guys and then come to you with my finishing move, I have 2 combo points since I have 2 successful hits, which means advantage 2, which means double it twice. So I'm coming at you with an attack with ×4 on it, which, since all characters start with 10 hit points and we're rolling 6-sided dice for these attacks, can be very deadly very quickly. Speaking of dying, we're going to start talking about damage, hit points, resting, etc. For damage, there are 2 main types, lethal and non-lethal. Whoa. Unless specified, most damage referred to in the text is lethal. Can you guess what lethal damage causes you to lose? Lethal damage causes you to lose hit points, and the most common sources of lethal damage are attacks in combat, things like fire, poison, acid, and other effects. Taking too much lethal damage will cause you to die. Wow, what a shocker. However, creatures can also be threatened with execution. This is something that I feel like D&D needs. So I'm going to put it here in this system. You know, your knife to the throat, your crossbow to the back of your head, and of course your beheading. The target of an execution can be any adjacent combatant who's on the chopping block or in the guillotine. Even though you might not want to be executed, you have consented to it in this form. A combatant whose combatant's power equals 0 when they're unable to act, which includes sleeping, being unconscious, paralyzed, immobilized, or otherwise helpless. I should be a little bit more specific with that, but the main one is sleeping, being unconscious. For example, when you get choked, you go down to 0 power, someone can execute you right then. The execution, it's not a kind of attack, it is like a special action performed by rolling 1 action die. On a roll of 1, it's a failed execution, and the victim is reduced to 0 hit points. But on a roll of 2 or higher, the victim dies immediately. Now, execution is a touchy subject because that means your BBEGs can be executed, your players can be executed, etc. The things on this page, combos and executions, should be used sparingly by the DM, at least in the beginning, because they can be super deadly, super quickly. And as far as your BBEGs being executed goes, I really don't like the feeling of sneaking up on the guy in the dark, and you're like, I'm going to cut his throat with my knife. And you're like, okay, deal 1d4 damage, and the guy has 150 hit points. Here, there's no hit point buffer to kind of get rid of that. No matter how many hit points he has, he can be executed. And rather than taking those like stat-based precautions, the BBEGs need to take like physical in-game precautions, like having more guards, having more defenses, etc. Things like that. So that was all about lethal damage. We also have non-lethal damage, which causes you to lose dice. Remember that this can lead to lethal damage, since if you lose more dice than are in your pool, you take damage equal to the number of dice lost below 0, which we'll talk about right now with falling and being pushed into walls. The wall splat. Gotta love a good wall splat. Non-lethal damage is usually caused by blunt force and sometimes magic. For falling, you take 2 non-lethal damage for every meter. The fact that it's 2 rather than 1 is kind of maybe like hard to remember, or something that you might forget. You might think it's one damage for every meter, but I think it's important to make it 2 because falls can be pretty deadly pretty quickly as well. All of this is kind of very specific, might need to be referenced. Ideally, most of these rules won't have to be referenced. It's simple and light enough that you can play without the book. But, anyway, a character can intentionally drop up to 2 meters before they start falling. To drop, a character must use enough movement to go over the edge. So if I wanted to tactically jump off the balcony versus if someone would push me off the balcony, it would have a different outcome. For example, character has 3 dice in their pool. They want to drop off a 3-meter ledge. They would take 2 non-lethal damage. So that's like, I'm here with my 4 dice. I spend 1 of them to move. I move over. I fall. I take 2 non-lethal damage. Since I can fall or I can drop 2 meters, and then that extra meter that I'm falling, I take 2 non-lethal damage, causing me to lose 2 dice. So I'm down to 1 die. If you fall at any time during your descent, you will land prone. If you drop off, you land on your feet, but if you fall, you land prone. If instead I'm sitting here with my 3 dice, and I'm pushed off this ledge, I would take 6 non-lethal damage, which would cause me to lose 3 dice and 3 hit points. 6 damage because it's 2 for each meter, and 3 dice and 3 hit points because the first 3 damage is non-lethal coming off of my dice, and then the extra 3 dice that I would lose are lethal damage instead. That's falling. Being pushed into a wall is 1 non-lethal damage for each meter you could not be pushed. So a character here standing with 3 dice in their pool adjacent to a wall, this wall, pushed 2 meters into the wall, would take 2 non-lethal damage, losing 2 dice. That's pretty straightforward. If instead that character was 1 meter away from the wall when they were pushed those 2 meters, they'd be pushed the first meter and then fail to push the extra meter into the wall, taking 1 non-lethal damage, losing 1 die, etc. Speaking of damage, resistance X and vulnerability X. I should note that there are no damage types currently. The main ones would be physical damage and fire. There's not a lot of magic. There's not a lot of different damage types to encounter. But I might have to add them in eventually. Also, a lot of this ruling discusses magical creatures, magical spells, and potions and things that will not necessarily be encountered frequently, but it's the most common example of resistance and vulnerability. These change the damage you take from a specific type. Resistance X causes you to take X more damage from each instance of that, or sorry, X less damage from each instance of that damage, while vulnerability X causes a creature to take X more damage. So if a creature has multiple resistances and vulnerabilities to a single type, they cancel each other out, applied simultaneously, as you can imagine. And the changes to damage are applied to each source or instance of damage individually and can be applied multiple times per turn. I have a long example here. Let's say a wizard drinks a fire resistance 1 potion and casts a spell that gives them fire resistance 2. If the wizard then falls into a furnace that would deal 3 fire damage per turn, they instead take no damage. If they were then blasted by a firebolt that deals 6 damage, they would resist 3 of it and take 3 fire damage. If an anti-magic cone is directed at the wizard, causing the spell to fizzle, but not the potion, they would lose that too. And they are hit with a spell that applies fire vulnerability to, goes down 2 more. The furnace would deal 4 damage at the start of their turn, which is 3 damage from the furnace, plus 2 from the spell, minus 1 from the potion. Typically, this is caused by magic or potions, but it can also be intrinsic to a creature. For example, something like a red draconian may have fire resistance 2, while something like a red dragon may have fire resistance 10. I should note that there's no immunity or invulnerability here. I don't know where I heard it, or if I heard it somewhere, but the thought of like a red dragon should be able to chill among normal fire, but if it was placed on the surface of the sun, it would not chill anymore. So like a fire resistance 10, if that fire deals 1 point of damage every turn, it's totally fine. If you blast it with a firebolt, it's totally fine. But if it flies into the sun, it will still die. It will not be immune to fire damage. Things like fire elementals, stuff like that, I can see, but those are not necessarily part of this system. Now we get to hit points. How are you going to die? Remember that we start with 10 hit points. They're a measure of your life force, or the amount of damage you can take before succumbing. And rather than, I know in some systems it's like extrapolated to be a measure of your luck or a measure of your energy and your perseverance through the fight, where only the last few hit points are really like the damage that you take. Here, as discussed earlier with the successful defense and the failed defense, each hit is a real hit. It's going to hit you for damage. Starting with 10 hit points is intentionally deadly. If you leave yourself exposed, a single heavy attack could kill you. The chances of that are pretty low. I believe if you had no hit point, or if you had no armor, you were at max hit points. The attacker would have to hit you with a heavy attack that rolls 2 6s, and then you would have to roll 2 1s on your silence value here, which we'll get into a second, which I believe is 1 in 1296. Very low possibility, but it may be too deadly and is inappropriate for some tables. Feel free to adjust it to your table as needed. But some useful definitions follow. Silence is death. At any time a combatant has current hit point value. Silence is death. At any time a combatant has a current hit point value between their maximum and a certain negative value known as silence, the silence number, or the silence value. This number is determined when a combatant becomes wounded, we'll get into that shortly, by negating a roll of 2 OD. Those are the outer dice. So as soon as you drop to 0 or lower, you roll 2 dice to determine your silence value. If you roll a 6, it would be -6. If you roll a 10, it would be -10, etc. If a combatant's current hit points is ever at or below their silence value, they have died. So, wounded and harmed are the two important keywords here. Wounded refers to being in the negative or at 0, and harmed is a condition that lasts with you until you return to your max hit points. It's only concerned with healing from resting. The wounded combatants are on the brink of death. Whenever a combatant's current hit point value is at or below 0, they become both wounded and harmed. They remain wounded until they return to 1. They remained harmed until they return to max. While wounded, all tasks that would normally require you to spend dice, think interact with object, run, crawl, drop, stand up from prone, jump, etc., now require you to roll them. It has no effect on the outcome of the task, but it will move you closer to death for each one rolled on any action die while wounded. This includes dice that would normally require or actions that would normally require you to roll, like attacking, defending, etc. You lose 1 hit point. This is for each one rolled on the dice, which comes immediately after the task resolves. So, for example, you would hit someone, deal the damage. Say you roll a 1 on your attack, you still hit them, deal damage, then you lose your 1 HP. Or if you're defending and you roll a 1 on your defense, you would make your defense, take the damage from their attack, and then lose your 1 HP. Combatant remains wounded until they're returned to 1 or more HP, as we mentioned before. While harmed combatants have had a brush with death. This means once you dip below 0, you're harmed until you return to your maximum HP, and this determines how quickly you heal from resting, as we were saying. Tending to wounds. Have yet to see how this plays out in a campaign, as most of the playtesting has been arena-style brawls, but tending to wounds helps a combatant escape the brink of death. A healer's kit can be used to tend to wounds. It takes 10 minutes to close wounds and prevent infection and facilitate healing. You can also spend 10 minutes using other resources like fresh water, bandages, foliage, splints, whatever else may be necessary without a healer's kit. Successfully tending to a wounded combatant puts them at 0 HP. That is intentionally not 1. It will not make you unwounded, but it will mean that the next time you rest, you will be no longer wounded. It's a little slow. I love the feel of AD&D where every other day you return 1 hit point. It's not quite as slow as that, but I do want it to be a little slower than 5e because you have such low hit points. You have slightly slower healing. Each encounter should be something that you want to approach tactically and approach with the intention of not taking damage, or at the very least not dropping below 0. So we have the short rest, the long rest, and the full rest. A short rest is HP can be regained by resting for at least 1 hour, consuming food or drink, as we know. Long rest is by sleeping for at least 6 hours and consuming food and drink. While a full rest causes HP to regain, you can become unharmed, and level ups can occur by resting and doing light activity in a safe area for 7 days with adequate food and drink. This is a week-long rest that will put you at max, let you level up, etc. So another thing I would like to see where the campaign doesn't take place over the course of like 10 days, for allowing events in the world to take place, you can take the time to have these week-long rests without it being a big like FOMO experience, I guess, for the characters or the players. Without nourishment, they are as effective as the rest below them. So long rests confer the benefit of a short rest, and short rests confer no benefit. You can only complete a long rest once per day, while you can complete as many short rests as you want, and full rests are impossible without nourishment. So you're regaining HP based on whether you're harmed or unharmed. Note that youthful characters regain twice as much HP, but we'll get into that with character creation very soon. While unharmed, short rests restore 1 OD HP, and long rests return you to max. So if you haven't dropped below 0, it works kind of like it does in 5e. You get a die out of your 10 total hit points on a short rest, and you're back to max at full. But if you're harmed, if you have dropped below 0, the short rest will only restore 1 hit point, and the long rest will restore 1 OD hit points. Whenever you complete a full rest, you return to max HP and become unharmed. So that's kind of, no matter how low you are, don't worry about it. We'll just take our 7 days and be back to normal. Character creation. So, one moment. As I mentioned before, this is a very light system in comparison to some others. So we don't have races, we don't have classes, we don't have ability scores. What are we choosing in our character creation? There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 builds to choose from currently. There's no distinct class or level system, so a character's training and ability is defined by their perks, as we'll get into. It is basically as close as I could get to a Skyrim type level up system. We'll see it shortly. In Regicide's setting, hello Brendan, all characters are human. So while there's no race, bloodline, or heritage system here, it could easily be represented using unique perks or attributes if your table plays in a different setting. So if you're playing in classic Forgotten Realms setting, you can have you can add unique perks based on your table to represent those races and things at the start of the game. But in Regicide setting, we're all human. Of course, side note, I know we're all professionals here, but it's important to loosely define your character's personality and background at this stage. What your character believes in is very important to understand, and while there's no way to know at the start, a few intriguing pieces of info can grow into a branching story that gives your character depth and agency. So that's the stuff we're looking for. So these 7 builds that you get to choose from at the start are the Ancient Spark. We'll talk about this later, some other day with magic. But the Ancient Spark gives you the Sixth Sense perk, which is basically the ability to sense magic and magic items in a small radius around you. Experienced, which gives you the Linguist, Literate, and Crafting perks. Linguist means you gain an extra language. Literate means you can read and write. Note that means that not everyone can read and write, only people with that perk. And the Crafting perks, which will be relevant later. Mageborn gives you twice as much gall. We'll talk about that with magic as well. These are the people whose bodies are more receptive to magic, less likely to become twisted by it. They're special people. Did I say 7? It looks like there's 6. Unbreakable and Violent are the next 2. They're kind of the same idea, but one is for the defensive type and one is for the attacking type. For Unbreakable, whenever you make your first defense roll each round, you gain 1 AD. And for Violent, whenever you make your first attack roll each round, you gain 1 AD. So it's incentivizing you to defend, incentivizing you to attack by making your first one basically free. And the youthful characters will gain twice as much HP from all sources. As we mentioned, all characters start with 10 hit points, 4 power, and a speed of 4 meters. Now these perks that are in place of a class system. Ideally, it makes the question, what is your character, more interesting, rather than saying, oh, he's a 3rd level human fighter. You get to say, it's easy to say, oh, he takes perks from the warrior tree, or oh, he's focused on using the bow or using the axe. But just a little extra information, which will also open up interesting options as you level up. Meaning, don't necessarily have to multi-class or do anything as drastic. You can snake your way over to other sections of the perk tree as you go. I should pull up the picture of it so I can give you a visual as we talk about this. One moment. Okay. Sharing screen. Opening system settings. Allowing Google Chrome. We'll have to do it later. I can pull it up in the book. One moment. Where's the book? The book is up here. The perk system. As you know from Skyrim, if you played it, has three main classes. There's the warrior, the thief, and the mage, like the stones that you select at the beginning. And it also has how would you say, different skills like archery, two-handing, etc. That part is absent here. Each perk is in just those three categories. And I know somewhere in here is the picture of it. Here we go. So this is Regicide Playtest 1, the original book. And here is the drawing that we'll be discussing of the perk tree, which is kind of like from the inside out, working your way up towards the outside. So perks track your character's ability and progression. Some perks have prerequisites, which must be met before purchasing the perk. This is not very common. Mostly you just need the prerequisites that are discussed here. Perk points are awarded by your game master. These are like your levels or your experience points, for example. After completing a difficult task or advancing the story, you used to purchase perks. When perks are purchased, it's called a level up. Remember that this can only be experienced at the end of a full rest, the week-long rest. You're not required to level up at the end of a full rest. You're not required to spend all of your perk points on a level up, and you're not required to spend any of them if you want. The progression section, which is right here, we'll get into that a little bit more. The cost of a perk is determined by its group. There are 4 groups organized in ascending order, which we will see here. The groups in the middle, the first group costs 1 perk point. Groups on the next cost 2, third cost 3, fourth cost 4 perk points each. And within each group, there are a number of perk sets. Perk sets have a defined color and cost. The 4 main colors are red, green, blue, and white, representing the warrior, thief, and mage, as well as general pools, respectively. General, in this case, meaning like common among all classes, not general of an army. The color of a set organizes the perks based on what abilities they confer. Multicolored sets are both colors. Perk points in progression. Perk points are one type of reward that can be earned by completing challenges. As you may imagine, hero dice, currency, equipment, unique perks, information, other treasures, these can all be awarded by the game master for completing difficult tasks or advancing the story. These tasks are typically set in motion by the players, as your table's setting or campaign dictates. And the rewards can be in-world, like items and information, or out-of-world, specific to the system, like perk points and hero dice, and should fit the challenge. Not all items that can be gained by completing a task need to be laid out ahead of time, but it can add some incentive. For instance, if the characters know or believe that a magical sword is hidden in the cave, it can be listed as one of the rewards for completing that challenge, in addition to perk points, hero dice, etc., depending on the difficulty or importance of the task. I found it helpful to gamify these things in D&D. It's not always necessary, but giving them that list of things like, oh, if I go to the cave, I will get a perk point, for example. Or if I beat the boss at the end of the cave, I'll get my hero dice, etc. These can make it a little more straightforward, depending on how you like your table to be run. But we all know how to run our own tables. The perks in this tree generally represent skills that you can train for. Sometimes perk can be earned outside of a level up by magical means, and other skills not represented by perks can only be learned by seeking out teachers and mentors. Others still can be earned through extraordinary means, which we'll talk about someday, with devoted worshippers being granted powers by their deity, foolhardy adventurers making deals with supernatural creatures, etc. And others can be earned from unique experiences. I like the idea of, after leaving a dungeon through a secret back entrance, party marvels at the craftsmanship of the concealed sections and learns to better recognize that type of work in the future. So if that kind of thing happens, you could give your whole party a little mini perk where they have, advantage one on locating secret doors or something like that. Could even be more specific, like advantage on locating secret doors designed by this person or this faction or group of enemies. You're encouraged to make unique perks and work with your game master to create personalized characters. The list of perks is still in the works, perks in the works, and they're pretty general, but character specific progression and things like that, at least at the tables I play at, is a very important part of the game. And this system is meant to facilitate that kind of thing, where you don't need to add or replace parts of a class level up structure. You can just hand out unique abilities, call them perks, or you can discuss like, hey, next time I level up, can I spend these perks on this unique perk instead of just giving it out for free? Things like that. As we mentioned here for the third time, when perks are purchased, it's called a level up. And again, it's at the end of a full rest. You don't have to spend anything or all of it, etc. To take a perk from a chosen set. So I'll just hold up. Each of these blobs is a set. Like this would be Mage 3. This would be Warrior 2, for example. Warrior Thief 3, things like that. Can the GM come up with their own perks? I would say absolutely. As far as monsters and enemies go, we'll talk about that. They are totally free reign, pretty much. GM can come up with anything there. To take a perk from one of these sets, you must meet the prerequisites for the perk. You must have at least one perk from the group directly below it. This does not apply to the first, what are they called? The first group. So perks in group 1, obviously you can take a warrior 1, you can take a thief 1, or a general 1, or a mage 1 without any prerequisites. Those are your most basic perks. And the chosen set must share at least one color with at least one previously purchased perk from the group directly below it. That's very specific and is not necessarily needed at all tables. You could go totally free reign and take any perk as long as you have one from below it. Or you could be even more rigid and say you can't dip into other pools. But that's going to depend on that's going to depend on your table. General sets do not count as any other color. These are the white sets, the common ones among all people. To take a perk from a general pool, you must have at least one perk from any set in the group directly below it. However, it doesn't go the other way. You're not able to take a perk from a higher group if the only perk below is from a general set, because they could not share at least one color. For example, in this current version of the rules, if the only perk you had in group 2, I'll try to point this out as we go. Group 2 is all of these ones here in this ring that cost 2 perk points. If the only perk you had in group 2 was from MW2, that's Mage Warrior 2, the blue and red one here, and you wanted to take a perk from group 3, you could choose any set other than T3, which is this one over here. Because, for example, this one shares red, these all share red, these are red and blue, this one shares blue, and general, of course, you can take always. If the only perk instead was from M2, this Mage 2, this blue one here, instead you could choose from General 3, TM3, M3, or MW3. And if the only perk you had in group 3 was from G3, this general 3 perk, you would not be able to take a group from perk 4, or from group 4, because it couldn't share at least one color. Something of a roleplay adventure. We got to bring that back. Someone has to restore the lost files. Can I talk about the combination perks? Do I need to have a fighter and a thief perk to take a red-green one? So, did that answer your question? Currently, it's just at least one color. So if you have a red and green one, and there's a green and red one above it, you could take it. Yeah. Now, as we said before, this is all up to your table. You can give them more options or less depending on how wide you want people to be able to be kind of a jack of all trades, or whether you want them to specialize, etc. Now, encounters. If this is not the first TTRPG you've played, you don't need to be told how to run your games. As such, the following section will be kept brief. We are all professionals here. The setting. I'll talk about the setting again some other day in more detail. But Regicide is set in a low power level post-apocalyptic world that we'll talk to another day. Zombie apocalypse, specifically. Depending on what setting your table likes to experience, this apocalypse, if you choose to include it, can occur at any time period. Regicide is designed with a classic medieval fantasy setting in mind, but it's kept vague to fit the ideas for your world. The most important thing to remember is, of course, you need good reasons for adventuring, good reasons for your party to stick together, good goals, etc. Otherwise, you can push this system as far as you want, make it into a space-faring adventure system. Have a good time at class, Mr. Brendan. Etc. So the pillars of adventure: exploration, combat, social, and also throw downtime in here. For exploration, it could be useful, depending on your table, to break it into hexes or things of that nature to be explored. It's mostly important in the rules way for determining whether an area is safe to conduct a full rest. Because that week-long rest, you don't want to be really rolling random encounters every night or anything like that. You want to be able to determine whether or not an area is cleared or otherwise safe. For combat, you want to threaten your adventurers, but the goal isn't necessarily to kill them. Really, this system wants to put an emphasis on stealth, or deciding when to approach, how to approach, tactically approaching a situation, which should be made as exciting and challenging as possible. Because once the combat ensues, it can turn pretty quickly. Most enemies in Regicide are human or undead. Monsters are pretty rare and will usually only be encountered if you're hunting them down. And as mentioned earlier, enemies can have unique abilities that are totally up to game master discretion. The kind of working on the edge of the rules, maybe even outside of them. Social encounters. This is obviously a post-apocalypse, so keep that in mind. But there are no insight checks, there are no deception checks currently or anything like that. So it's really focused on the real role play for the social encounters. And for the downtime, there's crafting, training, researching, etc. You can develop reasons as to why you're taking these perks. If you're taking the archery, some kind of archery perk, you can say, oh, in my week-long rest, I practice archery every day, etc. Things like that for flavor. Magic. We're going to skip over this little section about magic until we get into it later. But for the rest of the equipment, we have a system kind of like the old Baldur's Gates, like Dark Alliance, or things like, what's that one, Champions of Norath? Yeah. Stuff like that, where you have your kind of grid of items. I know a lot of people don't like inventory management or keeping track of it, so up to your table, whether or not it's part of it. But in the rules here, Each character has 18 inventory slots representing the objects they are carrying in their bags and belts, and multiple slots can be used to represent a single large bag, etc. Items that take up one slot are things like your dagger, your potion case, your coin pouch, your torch, your rations kit, etc. 2 slots for the short sword, the longbow, the hatchet, the rope, the bedroll, etc. 3 slots for the longsword, the longbow, the tent, etc. While worn items such as clothing, jewelry, bags, shields, and armor do not take up inventory space. Yes, starting equipment. Starting equipment is based on your story, of course, but in this setting, no one's really starting with anything good. It's nothing better than leather armor, maybe a club or dagger. If you're wealthier or you have some other reason, you may have a mace or sword to begin with. But much of what you discover in the world will be old and rusty, but strong. There should be a little bit of an emphasis on scavenging for gear, taking the best from your enemies, etc. So there's always room to improve in that way. Never been a huge fan of starting off with plate armor, for example, but you know. And finally, a little note on how equipment is handled. This is very much specific to weapons, but it's kept a little open in case there's a specific item that this will be pertinent to. It will come in 3 varieties of quality: normal, fragile, and broken. This is most applicable to weapons, as we said. Normal items are well constructed and do not normally break. Since it's a post-apocalypse, some found items may be fragile or broken. Fragile items break if a 1 is ever rolled while using them, and broken items are unusable without repair. Remember that you can break your weapon over somebody's head. But how do you repair your weapon? I'm glad you asked. Items are repaired by combining them with another weapon. Yes, for a long time I was considering what's the trade-off? What kind of resource management do we want here? Like in a video game where you're like, collect, I'm gonna scrap this weapon and add 10 metal scraps to my inventory. But no, it is all just based on the items. A fragile or broken weapon can be made normal by destroying 1 item of any quality and combining them. This process takes 1 hour. So if you have 2 short swords, both of which are broken, you can combine them to make 1 whole short sword. If you have an axe that's broken and a dagger of any quality, you can combine them to fix your axe in kind of like a Mad Max style wacky weapons. I think it'll be cool, but again, it has yet to be play tested in a real campaign, as we're mostly dealing with arena type brawls. Of course, we also have our things like potions, magic items, trinkets, etc. that will not be covered in the rules section because they're largely dependent on the setting, the characters involved in the story, etc. Just remember that items can be found in all sorts of places, not just on a corpse. And that is the end of the combat, character creation, and equipment sections. We have magic to go through, as well as world information and lore, which we'll save for another day. Any questions, Phoenix? All right. If not, have a beautiful and perfect day, and I will see you again in the future.